good morning again. I never realized how tough Amanda is to follow sometimes, but that was a great way that she told that story. If you're visiting today or you're relatively new to our wonderful church, I'm not a member of the staff. I've been a pastor for 40 years, and COVID shut my last church down, but I've served all over the world and all over this country. And my wife and I landed here in this church when we moved to be closer to our grandkids and we moved from Atlanta. So once in a while, I fill in when the staff is on the road, and they were very much on the road the last few weeks. I decided to put some sermon notes in your bulletin. You can use them or not use them, but I have for decades always put sermon notes in, and I thought, well, I'll try it this Sunday. But I do want to talk about this very familiar story, and sometimes it's hard for us to focus on a story that's so familiar, but Jesus was, I think, unarguably one of the greatest storytellers that ever lived. And he used these stories to teach. He created stories to teach something that was central to living the Christian life and to following him as a Christian. I have, as I've mentioned to you before, I've spent a great deal of my life overseas, and many, many years I've spent working with people who never heard of Jesus Christ through no fault of their own. I lived in very rural areas where there was no infrastructure whatsoever. There were no books, there was no electricity, no water, no roads, no stores, no money, no currency. So it makes sense that people would grow up never having seen a book. I mean, I lived with people that never held a book in their hands. They're for generations. And so the Bible was a very foreign idea and construction to them. But when I embedded myself into their lives and learned their language, which was Swahili in Africa, and I told them that I was a Christian pastor, and I began to teach them about Christ, they often responded with one of a few things that they had heard in some distant way about Christianity or about Christ. And one of them was the Good Samaritan. And they would talk a little bit about what they had heard and what I explained to them what that story was. So I've often thought about this story, and I've wondered about why it is that the Good Samaritan story seems to stand out among a few others, like the Sermon on the Mount. People have heard of that before. But these are people that just never knew that Jesus Christ was God. They had a relationship with God because, as I've said to you before, God wasn't waiting around for me to show up in the 20th century to be present in people's lives. His Spirit was alive and well. So people would often say to me, oh, that's Jesus. I didn't know that was Jesus, but I know him. I know God. But the Bible was something new, and they grew to love the Bible. I would get them volumes of and editions of the Bible in Swahili and teach them how to read. And they were farmers, so they loved the farming stories. They loved the safari or journey stories like the Samaritan story because they were always walking wherever they went, like the people in the story today. So I thought it would be good for us to take a fresh look at the Samaritan story and ask ourselves, why is it so attractive to both non-believers and believers, to people that grew up reading the Bible and people who never knew the Bible was a book because they had never seen a book before in their lives. This story comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, And I'm looking at it as a kind of modern day version of the Good Samaritan story, because I always remember that Jesus told these stories for a reason. It's not that he had nothing else to do, but he created stories to teach us, to help us focus on the most important things in life. So in Luke chapter 10, Jesus begins with identifying the person who was an expert in the law that came to try to test Jesus one day. And an expert in the law was unquestionably a Pharisee, because the Pharisees were people who studied the law. They studied, and the law is the law of Moses. It's the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And the Pharisees were the experts. They not only learned the Torah and they learned the religious laws, but they taught them and they applied them to people's lives. So it's pretty clear that this was one of the many Pharisees that was around at the time of Jesus who came to see Jesus. And it says he came to test Jesus, which was pretty common because Jesus was very smart and very learned, obviously, about the Bible because it's his word. And so this expert in the law comes to Jesus and says, "Teacher," which is the English word for rabbi. So we would have addressed him as rabbi in Hebrew. And he asks them this question: "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, let's be honest, that's the universal question we all ask ourselves. You know, and we ask it kind of in upside down ways. We say, now, have I done enough? And when am I going to die? And what's going to happen after I die? But what must I do that I'm not doing to inherit eternal life? So Jesus meets him where he's at. He knows this guy knows the law. He knows the doctrine, you might say. So he says to him, well, what's written in the religious laws? What do you read there? You tell me. You know the answer to this question. And so the guy does that. He says, yeah, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So he repeats the 2 great commandments: the love of God and the love of others. And he simply recites these 2 great commandments. But who can argue with that answer? Jesus doesn't argue with it. In fact, he says, you're right, that's the perfect answer. You've answered correctly, Jesus says. And then he says this: do these 2 things, and you will live. Now, here's an interesting twist in the story. It says, but wishing to justify himself, this lawyer said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Years ago, when I lived in Africa, there was an old woman, a very old woman, who had built this small hut, inside of which she had about 6 peacocks. And I used to think, how the heck did she ever get a peacock, much less 6 of them? But they were beautiful. And they had the long tails, and she'd let them out every day. And if I was in the area, I'd go by to see them. And I got to know this lady. And I think this PhD teacher of the law was acting a little bit like a peacock when he fluffed up his feathers. And he asked Jesus the question, well, big shot, who is my neighbor that I should love as myself? Because he's wishing to justify himself. He's wishing to make himself feel right, that he's done enough. But this is a bit of a challenge for him, because he's not quite sure how Jesus will answer it. The question about who is my neighbor? Who should I love as much as I love myself? And really, I think that's the challenge of this story. It's the answer to the question, who is my neighbor? Who should you and I love and take care of in our lives? And when we read this story, we understand what Jesus is saying to him and what he's saying to each of us. That it might be on one level easier for us to say, I love the Lord my God with all my heart and with all my soul and with all my strength and with all my mind. And yes, sometimes I sin and sometimes I mess up. But when it comes to loving my neighbor as myself, who exactly does that include? And does it exclude anyone? Do I have any right to back away from people who maybe don't deserve it? I think that's the key question of this story. Not, am I doing enough to earn eternal life? But to whom should I show Christian love? Who earns that love from me? My non-Christian friends hinted and implied when they heard I was a Christian pastor that we may not have heard of Jesus Christ and that name, and we may never have known there was a Bible. But we know that something about Christianity, about the teachings of Christ, challenges us to look at how we relate to other people that God brings into our lives. So I think this most important question is the tougher question of the two. Not how am I doing enough and how do I enter eternal life, but who is my neighbor and to whom should I show love? And so Jesus tells this Good Samaritan story to answer the question. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now that's a 17-mile journey, and it's by foot or maybe by donkey, by mule, but it's 17 very dangerous miles. And you lose from Jericho to Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem rather to Jericho, you lose 3,000 feet in altitude. So that road drops. And if you're coming up to Jerusalem, which people did routinely, try walking 17 miles on a rocky dirt road and walk 3,000 feet in elevation. It is very tough to do that. I don't know if any of us could do that today. 17 miles is a long way. And it's a dangerous road because there are a lot of caves and places where gangs and thugs can hide out and grab your stuff, beat you up, and escape quickly. And this is what happened. This man was walking from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among some robbers. They stripped him, beat him, left him half dead by the side of the road. Not an uncommon thing on that 17 miles of road. And Jesus continues and he says, by chance, a priest was going down the road and he saw him. He moved over to the other side and passed by him. Here's a priest whose job is to offer sacrifices in the temple, in the synagogue. He leads worship. He's a very religious man, very academically trained. He saw this man half dead, stripped naked, and he kept going. And then a Levite came, and he saw him lying on the road, and he passed by. Now, a Levite was a guy that belonged to a small group of people called the Levites who were responsible for the tabernacle in the synagogue, in the temple, which was where they kept the scroll. They kept the Torah. And the Torahs are huge. If you've ever been to a synagogue and you see them, they roll them out, and they'll roll out the scroll this way, and then they'll roll back the other until they find the passage in Scripture. There's specific references to Jesus going into the synagogue and walking up and rolling open the scroll. That's the Torah. And it's a series of parchments that they would stitch together, and the scribes would write down the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And this guy passed by as well. So Jesus is telling this expert in the religious laws, this Pharisee, that both the priest and the Levite should have walked over to the man lying half dead by the side of the road and asked, "What's going on? What can I do to help you?" But they did what you and I sometimes do. They came up with their own reasons why they couldn't do this. He's probably dead. Or if he's not dead, he's close to death. And if I touch a dead person, I defile myself, which means I can't go to work. I don't get any pay. I can't do my job in the temple. I have to be spiritually cleansed, and that's a process that takes days and sometimes weeks. So they had their reasons. Oh, did they have their reasons? I'm looking in the mirror as I talk to you this morning. I have my reasons sometimes too. I wonder if this why, and I've wondered over the years if this isn't why my non-Christian friends wondered about Jesus and wondered about Christianity, because they probably, if not definitely, see themselves, like we all see ourselves at times, in the priest and the Levite, who just didn't, we do this a lot. I don't have time, Maybe tomorrow I'll try it. But we walk by and we wonder, who is my neighbor? And we look at people sometimes and we say, well, that person isn't my neighbor. He's trouble. That's who that guy is. Or we see somebody and we say, well, she's just going to be an interruption. And I just don't have time for that. We all have our stories. But here the story takes a sharp turn. And I had a teacher once who used to say, every time you read the Bible and you come to the word but, stop, because something's about to change. And Jesus says, but a Samaritan was on a journey. Now, the Samaritan was probably an important person at this point if he's heading into Jerusalem, or he was there and he's coming out of Jerusalem, because he wouldn't have been welcome in that city. He and the Samaritans and the Jews didn't get along. So it was probably somebody that was important, probably somebody that would not have run into as much pushback as just an average Samaritan would have. But when he comes to the man lying half dead on the side of the road, I think three of the most important words in the Bible appear. Jesus said, he felt compassion. That's a great description of Jesus, is it not? Think of it. All three men looked. Two of them kept going, but one did something that's enormously important if you want to know who your neighbor is. He stopped. And one of the things that kills us when it comes to helping other people is we don't want to stop. We have to keep going. Or we think if we stop, it's going to get us very involved, and we don't want to get involved. But I love the fact that this guy stopped, and that verb is repeated a couple of strategic times in this story. Two of them looked, two of them didn't stop. The third one looked, and he stopped. And the man who looked and stopped, Jesus said, he came to the man lying by the side of the road, bandaged up his wounds, poured oil and wine on them, put him on his own beast, surely a donkey, and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Now, the one person who would have been at odds with the Jews, and vice versa, goes to this undoubtedly Jewish man who's close to death, and he stops and takes care of him. It says on the next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave him to the innkeeper, and said to him, take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I return, I will repay you. And so Jesus asks the Pharisee, the expert in the religious laws, and the teachings of these, and the application of them in our lives. He says, all right, sir, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor of the man who fell into the robber's hands? And the expert in the religious laws answered Jesus, the one who showed mercy to him. And then Jesus said, again for the second time, go and do likewise. In other words, let's not just have a polite little intellectual academic conversation about it, but let's roll up our sleeves, let's put our boots on, and let's get dirty. Let's help. Let's make a difference. But to do that, you've got to stop. So let me ask you and myself a few questions. Does that fit me and my personality? Is that what I would do? And these are questions I ask myself daily. What am I really like as a Christian every day? Not just on Sunday, or not just when I'm preaching or listening to a sermon. What kind of a Samaritan, what kind of a odd duck am I? I know this is the 21st century. But what is your and my rightful place today, given our culture and the massive divisions that characterize our country and in our world? What is our rightful place in society? How should we act towards others when we see somebody half dead lying by the side of the road and he's not like you and he's not like me? Do you leave him for someone else? The Samaritan was the first of the three that saw somebody in need, about to die. And that's how he looked at him. He didn't see him as a Samaritan, didn't see him as a Jew. He just saw him as a fellow human being in trouble. And he stopped because something spoke to his heart. That's the first thing. He stopped. The second thing is, not only did he stop, but something spoke to his heart and he opened his heart. That's what happens when you and I stop. There's a cost to it. He not only saw him, but he opened his heart to him. And the reason he did these two things were because of those three great words. He showed compassion. And I think that's what piqued the curiosity of so many of the non-Christians that I lived with and embedded my life in for years. What does it mean to show compassion? He looked with compassion. We have to open our hearts to others when we look at people with compassion. We are church, after all. We are people who are Christians. And we must do three things, Jesus said. We must stop, we must look with compassion, and we must open our hearts to others. That's the definition or the description of Jesus' life. He stopped and became a child, and grew up, and sacrificed his life for us because he looked with compassion, even pity on us. And he opened his heart to us. Now listen carefully, this is really important. I think the heart of the Samaritan was beating faster than the other two hearts. Not because he was pumping more blood, but he was pumping more compassion through that heart. He was the only one consumed with saying, I'm going to make a difference today. I know I got to go to Jerusalem. I know I got work to do up there. And I know I may be misunderstood, and I know there's a risk for me, a Samaritan, bending down over a half-dead Jewish man. I could be blamed for that. All the ways other people could see me is coming to play. But do I open my eyes and do I open my heart when someone is in need? What's the issue if I don't? Do I ask myself, well, what color are they? Or do I say, well, are they straight or gay? Or do I ask myself, where are they from? Are they legal or illegal? Or what language do they speak? Or what if I'm a woman and I'm helping a man? Will I be misunderstood? Or vice versa, I'm a man and I'm helping a woman. Will I be blamed? I think this is part of the reason why Jesus told this story and why non-Christians are intrigued. It's a challenge to them as well. But not only did this Samaritan have an open heart, he had open hands. The scripture said he went to work immediately. I can't tell you how many times I've spent my life burying the dead and going to funeral homes. And the most common thing I hear is, "Oh, I'm so sorry. If you need me, give me a call." Or, I know you're going through a lot. Text me if there's anything I can do." You know, we are funny people sometimes. I am, at least, when I look in the mirror. Are you an illegal immigrant or are you legal? No, he got busy. He bandaged his wounds because his hands were open. He poured oil on his wounds and wine. That's all he had. But it had some medicinal value at that point. He was doing whatever he could to save his life. So my question to myself this week has been, do I act like a donkey? And I'm using the nice word for donkey. Or do I do nothing? Or am I like everybody else? Or most everybody else? Or do I pick him up and lay him on my donkey so that I can bring him for further care and take complete care of him? Am I going to do whatever it takes to help him out completely? Well, I only have a little bit of wine and oil, and I can't use it up all on him. I still have 13 more miles out of the 17 to go. Or am I going to tell myself, you know, a little wine and oil aren't going to be enough to bring him home to complete health again? You remember when the friend of Jesus took oil and perfume and wasted it on him? Do you remember that story? It's a similar kind of story. And the third question I want to ask is this. It's a question about our personal possessions. How much is it going to cost me? The Good Samaritan didn't bring him to the inn and tell the innkeeper, "You take care of him now. I've done all I can. I'm busy. I got a lot of things I got to do, but you take care of him." No, he said, "I'm going to give you enough money to take care of him really well for 3 weeks. And when I come back through on my way home, I'll stop and I'll make good on every denarii you have spent taking care of this man. My heart I will not allow to be tweaked open or to be cracked open. I want my heart to be kicked open." So our eyes need to be wide open, our hearts need to be wide open, our hands need to be wide open when someone needs us. And we can't look back on what it's costing us or the time it's costing us. Sometimes this is the biggest enemy we have. Jesus never wore one. Never heard of it. When I lived in Africa, I used to work with catechists who were like, I would train to be a pastor of each of the 20 villages that were spread out over hundreds of kilometers. And they would teach the Bible, and they never had a book in their life, so I had to teach them how to read Swahili and teach them how to think about the stories. And they loved it. But I'd always say, okay, in 2 weeks, we'll meet at this village at around 2 in the afternoon. And at 2 in the afternoon, they'd show up. And I was the only one that had one of these. And to this day, I don't know how they did it. But they did it. So friends, for me, this story is a way of asking you and me, and Jesus' way of asking non-Christians and Christians, when you see the need, do you feel the need? And when you feel the need, do you take care of the need? After all, that's what Christians do. And it doesn't matter how much education you have, because this guy, the Pharisee, he had more education than anybody. It's what Christians do. It's what followers of Christ do. It's what attracted Linda and me to this church. And our small group goes down every couple of months, and we do that breakfast downtown, and it was great. I love doing it. Last time I went, I met a woman from Kenya, and we were talking Swahili together, and I freaked her out. But it was a blast. And it was just a gift. It was a little bone that God threw me, because I never thought that would happen. But this is what Christianity is all about. This is what we give to the kids. I know I've said this to you before, but there's a great second century Christian monk named Francis of Assisi. You see his statue in a lot of the garden centers. He has this great prayer. He says, God, help me to preach the gospel, and if necessary, to use words. Jesus was telling us in this Samaritan story, this is how you spread the good news. This is how you preach. You don't have to quote scripture. You just got to love your neighbor as you love yourself. We don't have to do great things, in other words. We can do small things with great love. So let me close with a real quick story. And it did for me, this story, it clicked on a little light for me to step back and say, now I know what Jesus was trying to teach in the Good Samaritan story. When I got to Africa, I met a man, another missionary named Rab Murphy, and he and I hit it off. He was an old guy that had been out there for decades. And he was from Massachusetts, where I'm from. We were both fans of the Red Sox. And Rab was an old buck, but he loved me, and he was so glad to see a young guy come out and start working out there during the famine and the drought that was decimating everyone. And then one day, I got the news that he died of malaria. Well, where we lived, Lake Victoria was in our front yard, and the Serengeti was in our backyard. The Serengeti had 2 million animals. 1,100,000 were wildebeest alone. So you can imagine the flies and the mosquitoes that lived in the Serengeti. And in Lake Victoria, which is the second largest inland lake in the world, it was 3,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level, and it was the source of the Nile, and it moved north into the Mediterranean. Huge source of mosquitoes. I have a good friend who not long ago passed his medical exam, and he said one of the questions was, a patient walked into the office and was burning up with fever, complaining of eye sores, stomach ache, diarrhea, and I asked him, have you been out of the country? And he said, yeah, I just took a tour of Lake Victoria. Well, he got bitten by a mosquito that gave him malaria. We all got malaria when we lived there, despite everything we could do to keep that off of us, including sleeping under mosquito nets. And once in a while, I'd wake up in the morning, and my hand was against the net, and there was a big, fat, blood-filled mosquito on the outside of the net, and he bored through and drilled into my hand. And a week later, I was deathly sick. Well, Rab Murphy didn't make it, and he died. And I was in grief. And I went to the funeral, and my boss, the bishop, a Sukuma African man who raised himself up, got more education than I could never figure out how he got it. Then he went to Rome and got his doctorate, and he came back and he became a bishop. I loved listening to this guy because he was a common Sukuma man who spoke great Swahili, and I would always love to sit and talk with him because I'd learned so much from him about the language. So he gets up at Rab Murphy's funeral, and he says this, Huyu ndiye ni mtu mwenye moyo wa sadaka. He said, this man we are burying today is a man who had a heart that blesses others. And it was like a light bulb went off. I thought, Good Samaritan. He is a man who has a heart, or a woman, who blesses others. Is that not an incredible image to think about when Jesus says, and who is your neighbor? Well, my neighbor is someone who I allow my heart to bless. You see it? It to me was such a revelation. It's such a neat way of using Swahili words to create an image. And I thought, that's exactly what Jesus was saying. Yes, you can love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your soul. But when it comes to loving others, do you have what I have? Jesus is saying to us. Do you have a heart that blesses others? Because that's a great way of describing and coming to understand who Jesus is. And I think it's a perfect way for you and me every day when we get up to say, God, today, whatever happens to me and whoever you bring into my life, help me be a person who has a heart that blesses others whom you bring into my life this day. You may work in medicine, and you may be very good in the medicine you work in. But go in tomorrow thinking, God, how can I use my nursing or my surgery or my skills to be a blessing for others? You may be a teacher. You may be a business person. But imagine changing the conversation and saying, God, today, I want to be a person with a heart that blesses others. So let's pray.